Some questions walk into my study wearing old clothes. This is one of them. Genesis chapter 6, the sons of God, the Nephilim, giants in the land. It has been generating debate since long before the internet handed every curious believer a search bar. And so the question you typed into YouTube is exactly the question I have been asked in counseling sessions, in Sunday school hallways, and in letters slipped under my office door for 30 years. Are the sons of God in Genesis 6 actually fallen angels? And who or what were the Nephilim? Here is my direct pastoral answer. The text of Genesis 6 most naturally supports the view that the sons of God were fallen angelic beings who transgressed their created boundaries, and that the Nephilim were the violent, corrupted offspring that resulted. That is not a fringe reading. It is the oldest reading in Jewish and early Christian history. It is well supported by the biblical data, and understanding it changes how you read both the severity of the flood judgment and the cosmic scope of what God was doing to preserve the line that would eventually give us Jesus Christ. Now let me walk you through the scripture, because the text must do the work here. Genesis 6 to 1 through 4. In the English Standard Version, when man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came in to the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown." The Hebrew phrase translated sons of God is bene ha Elohim. That construction, bene ha Elohim, appears elsewhere in the Old Testament, and the usage is important. In Job 1 to 6, Job 2 to 1, and Job 38 to 7, bene ha Elohim refers unambiguously to angelic beings presenting themselves before God. The same phrase, the same construction. When Moses used it in Genesis 6, his original audience would have heard it the same way. It referred to supernatural beings of a heavenly order, not to men. The word Nephilim comes from the Hebrew root naphal, which means to fall. Whether you translate it as fallen ones or as those who cause others to fall, the word itself carries a connotation of violence, ruin, and descent from what is proper. When the spies in Numbers 13:33 see the descendants of Anak and say, "We seem to ourselves like grasshoppers," they use the same word, Nephilim, to describe what they saw. These were beings of terrifying physical and moral stature. Now I want to go to the New Testament, because the apostles did not leave this question unanswered. 2 Peter 2 to 4 says, "For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but cast them into hell and committed them to chains of gloomy darkness to be kept until the judgment." The Greek word Peter uses for cast into hell is tartaro. It appears nowhere else in the New Testament. Tartarus, in Greek understanding, was the deepest pit of the underworld, a place of confinement for the most severe supernatural transgressors. Peter is not talking about ordinary spiritual rebellion. He is talking about a specific sin of a specific category of angels, and he uses language precise enough to signal that Jude 6 and 7 connected even more tightly. And the angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, he has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day, just as Sodom and Gomorrah and the surrounding cities, which likewise indulged in sexual immorality and pursued unnatural desire, serve as an example by undergoing a punishment of eternal fire. The phrase Jude uses is eternal chains. The comparison he draws is to Sodom, to the crossing of a created boundary in the domain of sexuality. Jude is telling you without ambiguity that these imprisoned angels sinned in a way that was sexually transgressive, and he is anchoring that statement to Genesis 6. Here's where you might be thinking, but didn't Jesus say in Matthew 22:30 that angels do not marry? He did. For in the resurrection they neither marry nor give in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. But notice what Jesus said. Angels in heaven do not marry. He said nothing about fallen angels who abandoned their heavenly station. The text in Jude is precise. On this point, they left their proper dwelling. They acted outside the constraints of their created nature. That is precisely what made it a punishable transgression. Now let me address the objections, because you will hear them. Some will say the sons of God are simply the godly line of Seth, and the daughters of man are the ungodly line of Cain, and this passage describes nothing more than spiritually mixed marriages. That reading has a long history in the church, particularly after Augustine, and I respect the men who have held it, but it has real exegetical problems. The phrase bene elohim does not mean the Sethite line anywhere else in Scripture. Calling Cain's descendants daughters of man while calling Seth's line sons of God requires an interpretive step the text does not provide. And it does not explain the distinctiveness of the Nephilim. It does not explain the severity of the flood judgment. And it does not explain why Peter and Jude reach for such extreme language, tartaro, eternal chains, if this was merely a description of intermarriage between two family lines. John MacArthur, who has preached through Genesis carefully, has noted that the most natural and exegetically consistent reading of bene ha-Elohim in its Old Testament context points to angelic beings, and that the New Testament passages in Peter and Jude provide apostolic confirmation of that reading. That is not a minor endorsement. When the apostles themselves write about a passage, their interpretation carries binding interpretive weight for the church. I have also heard people say this is too strange to take literally, that it sounds like mythology, and that a serious Christian should not believe in half-breed creatures. I understand the discomfort, but the strangeness of a passage is not grounds for abandoning its plain meaning. The incarnation is strange by human standards. The resurrection is strange. The parting of the Red Sea is strange. We do not soften supernatural events because they press against our modern categories. The Bible is a book in which the supernatural operates. Genesis 6 is presenting a moment of catastrophic supernatural transgression, one so severe that God responded with a worldwide flood. And that is the theological point you must not miss. The flood was not merely God punishing human wickedness, though it was that. It was God defending the integrity of the human line through which the promised seed of Genesis 3:15 would come, the seed of the woman who would crush the serpent's head. If the corruption of humanity by fallen angelic beings had continued unchecked, the biological and moral contamination of that line would have been complete. Noah, finding grace in God's eyes in Genesis 6-8, is immediately followed by the text telling us Noah was blameless in his generations. The Hebrew is tamim, which means whole, unblemished, without mixture. God preserved a line. The flood was an act of redemptive rescue. If you are a believer sitting with this text on a Monday morning, here is what I want you to take away. First, the cosmic conflict described in Scripture is not metaphor. Ephesians 6:12 says, "You wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against rulers, against authorities, against cosmic powers over this present darkness, against spiritual forces of evil in heavenly places." Genesis 6 is the earliest exhibit in that conflict. The enemy of God has always sought to corrupt, to contaminate, and to destroy the line and the people through whom God works. That has not stopped. The methods have changed. The reality has not. Second, the judgment of God is sure and it is categorical. The angels who cross that boundary are in chains. Sodom burned. The flood came. God does not tolerate the transgression of created order indefinitely. That is not a threat to live in fear of. It is a truth that produces sobriety and worship. Third, and this is the gospel note on which I want to close, Noah found grace. In the middle of the most catastrophic display of divine judgment the world had seen, a man found grace. And the same God who shut the door of the ark is the God who opened a tomb 3 days after the crucifixion. The grace that preserved a human line through the flood is the same grace that now offers every person who comes to Christ a place in the eternal family of God. Genesis 6 is a dark chapter, but it ends with 8 people stepping off a boat onto a washed earth. Grace is always the word that survives the flood. If you have found this kind of teaching helpful, I hope you will come back, subscribe to this channel, and join us each week, the same way I would hope a visitor would find their way back to the church on Sunday morning. And if you have a question from Scripture that you have been sitting with, a passage that confuses you, or a doctrine you want examined carefully, leave it in the comments. I read them, and your question may become the next video. God bless you, and may the Word dwell richly in you this week.